It's interesting. There is a lot of stigma around mental health conditions. Still, it's unfortunate. There shouldn't be, but there is. And and so often patients will not disclose for a variety of reasons to their clinician that they're depressed, that they're suicidal, that they feel like harming someone else. They'll just keep that to themselves. There can also be lack of even self-awareness sometimes. People may actually think that their depression is a physical problem, and they often have physical manifestations, and and so they will come in with pain and aches, and they won't recognize it as a part of their depression. In fact, 45% of people who commit suicide have seen their primary care physician within the last 30 days before they committed suicide.
And now, from San Francisco and the UCSF Rosenman Institute, the Health Technology Podcast with your host, Christine Winoto.
What does a depressed person sound like? I don't know, and neither does any living person. But Kintsugi's AI technology does. My guest today, Prentice Tom, is the CMO of Kintsugi Health, a company developing this revolutionary way of diagnosing mental health disorders. Before his work with Kintsugi, Prentice led groundbreaking mental health programs at Vituity and served as the president of Galen Inpatient Physicians. He's an extremely qualified doctor with a degree from Harvard, a residency at Johns Hopkins, and experience at MIT. Here's our conversation. Well, thank you, Prentice, for joining me this morning.
It's a pleasure to be here, Christine. I'm looking forward to talking with you.
You have come a long way to where you are. Give us some background, like what brought you into healthcare, why you're interested in healthcare, and how you make that transition from being a physician to be working in the industry.
Sure, Christine. Well, as you mentioned, I initially went to medical school. I trained at Harvard, and then I did my residency at Johns Hopkins in emergency medicine. I went to academics initially and was on faculty at Stanford for a few years, and then joined a group in California that it was initially called California Emergency Physicians. Over the years, it morphed from a regional group that provided emergency physician services to a national group that provided a variety of hospital clinician services, including emergency medicine, anesthesia, ICU, hospice, and then more recently, teleneurology, telepsychiatry. And we've had a fairly large ambulatory care division for some time. I had the opportunity to serve as their chief medical officer for about 20 years, as well as their chief innovation officer and executive vice president. And during that time, had the opportunity to interact with a significant number of health technology companies, because a lot of technology companies were interested in seeing how they could partner with us, sell their tools to hospitals or to us as a physician group. And have seen just an enormous number and variety of technologies that have had significant potential in moving healthcare. In fact, I was participated in the original move, even just from handwritten charts to dictation, and then to electronic discharge instructions and electronic medical records, and just technology like that, the use of ultrasound in the emergency department, a lot of these tools. I had the opportunity to help lead the creation of a program called Empath Units, which is the integration of emergency psychiatric care with telepsychiatry, crisis stabilization units, and inpatient psychiatric care, and became very interested in understanding how we could improve um, the care of behavioral health conditions in the United States. At the time, the one of the largest issues in the U.S. was the underbedding, and still is the underbedding of inpatient psychiatric for inpatient psychiatry, and it's probably the most underbedded condition in the United States is emergency psychiatry. It takes sometimes 2.5 days for a patient to move from an emergency department to an inpatient psychiatric institute. And the reasons are that because of the problems with getting these people to an inpatient bed, it creates an enormous backlog in the emergency department, and it delays care for a significant number of patients, not just the patients who have the emergency psychiatric condition, but all the patients who now can't get to a bed. So by integrating services and by creating a telepsychiatry program, we were able to reduce the time literally from days to hours. And I recognized that it was really just simple technologies that could really change the care that was provided to a group of patients, and became involved with a group, Kintsugi, which was creating a novel AI tool with which in 20 seconds of any conversation, they can screen for depression and anxiety with the same accuracy as a clinician administered PHQ-9 or GAD-7 survey. And those are the surveys that are used by primary care physicians to screen for depression and anxiety. They're the most commonly used tools. And I initially started out as an advisor to their program, and they asked me to come on as their chief medical officer. And so that's essentially how I became involved with this particular company that I'm currently involved with.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned about you for moving psychiatry patient from ER to inpatient. It takes days, and then you change it to maybe a few hours. What was the process? Why it takes 2 days? Is it not enough time?
Well, so a patient typically presents with an emergent psychiatric condition. Most of the time, they're severely depressed, they're suicidal or homicidal. Sometimes they have an acute psychotic break, and they're just gravely disabled. The emergency department is not equipped to evaluate or treat those patients. We can provide some emergency medication to sometimes calm patients down, but we're really not equipped to evaluate those patients thoroughly, understand whether they're truly suicidal or homicidal. And so what happens is they're placed on a hold until they can be moved to an inpatient facility where they can be evaluated by a psychiatrist. Because of the underbedding, those units are typically completely full, and it can take multiple days for a bed to open up. In fact, in California, the average is about 2.5 days to move a patient from the emergency department to a facility where they can be evaluated. Well, we looked at creating a program, and it was led by an individual, Scott Zeller, who I recruited a number of years ago to the partnership to Vituity, which was the company I was with. It was previously called CP America, changed its name to Vituity. And he's pretty much been the national leader in looking at understanding how we can reduce the burden on inpatient psychiatry. And providing telepsychiatry and combining that with a crisis stabilization unit, which is a facility that only holds a patient for the first 23 hours and 59 minutes, we are able to create an opportunity to evaluate these patients almost immediately when they come to the emergency department. So they don't need to go to an inpatient facility. They can be seen by a psychiatrist, typically through a telepsychiatry option. If they do need some further stabilization, they can be admitted to a crisis stabilization unit for a period of time. Often those patients can be discharged immediately from the emergency department after the telepsych visit. because the psychiatrist is able to clear them, something the emergency physician can't do. And now what happens? So of the patients who are admitted to an inpatient psychiatric unit, approximately 2/3 of those patients never needed to be admitted. They weren't actually significantly suicidal or homicidal or gravely disabled. Now, because they are seen emergently and they are either discharged immediately from the emergency department or they're moved to a facility where they can get some urgent treatment prior to being moved to an inpatient unit. And we've reduced that stay from days to now 2.5 hours in the emergency department. One, we free up the emergency department bed. Given that it typically takes about 3 hours to see a patient in an emergency department bed, and we've moved that patient out 2 days early. Now you can see 8 patients a day in that bed. That's an additional 16 patients. So you're significantly improving emergency department flow. 2, you're decreasing the workload on the emergency physician who was otherwise caring for this patient who's staying in the department for 2.5 days. And now that emergency physician can spend that time seeing other patients. 3, you've reduced the risk to the hospital because you're not caring for a patient in the emergency department for prolonged periods of time, but you're moving them to the care that they need to be moved to. 4, you're significantly improving care. The emergency department just isn't a great place for a patient who has an emergency psychiatric condition. The emergency department are loud, they're noisy, people cannot pay attention to them. If anything, they're anxiety provoking and they create more problems for those patients. So now you're able to alleviate the patient in terms of the care environment. You're able to improve it immediately. And also you're able to get him to care immediately. So you're either able to see him by a psychiatrist or you're able to move him to somewhere where there's more definitive care available to them. And 5, because 2/3 of the patients never need to be admitted to an inpatient facility, you now offload beds. And so you open up that emergency inpatient facility so that they can actually handle the patients that need to be there. And 6, you improve the reimbursement both to the inpatient facility because the patients that need to be there are truly there. And you decrease the cost for caring for that patient because now the ones that don't need to be in an inpatient facility, you've discharged them immediately. It's essentially a win-win-win-win-win. There was no losers in creating these types of programs. And it's because of the advent of simple technology like telemedicine and virtual care that we're able to start to create those types of programs.
This podcast is sponsored by Brown Rudnick's Global Life Sciences Group, a team of legal professionals that help life science companies, lenders, and investors around the world turn good science into good business. Learn more at brownrudnick.com. This podcast is also sponsored by Canon Quality Group. Canon Quality Group has been helping medtech startups set up quality management systems for over 10 years. If you're unsure when to get started with quality management in your startup, turn to the experts at canonqualitygroup.com.
Do you think the program that you have, the telepsychiatry, do you think that is currently being implemented everywhere in the United States, or that's still not the norm?
Yes, there is enormous interest in it. And it is, it takes a lot of effort to create these types of programs because they take significant change in the clinical workflow. Also, there's a lot of integration that needs to occur, and you need to get a lot of different parties at the table because you need to work with the inpatient facility, you need to work with the hospital, you need to create a telemedicine program, you need to find the clinical labor force, you need to establish a crisis stabilization unit sometimes, which is a physical facility that needs support. And so it's definitely a very involved process, and it takes on the order of months to even sometimes a year or two to put these in place. So it's not a simple lift, but they are taking off and they are becoming much more common. And they are looked upon as one of the models of how we can improve emergency psychiatric care in the US.
Mhm. So tell us more about your work at Kintsugi, because it's really interesting what it does. Maybe you can start with, I think you mentioned it earlier about the technology, and if you can summarize it again, what does Kintsugi do and what difference it's going to make?
Thank you, Christine. Kintsugi has developed some truly elegant technology. It was started by Grace Chang and Rima Sayalova, and they are two software engineer, machine learning scientists that were truly creative and innovative in coming up with this. It's been recognized for approximately 100 years that individuals with behavioral health conditions speak differently. And it's been very difficult to create a mechanism of measuring what those differences are until very recently. And so they looked at how does how do psychiatric and behavioral health conditions affect psychomotor response. And they looked at voice production and sound production because that is a complex psychomotor response. And the tool does not look at what a person says. It looks at how the person speaks. And so it looks at the spectral and prosodic elements of how sound production is made. And through a AI algorithm, it's able to correlate those changes in how people are actually producing sound to their level of mental wellness and mental health condition. And specifically, they were able to look at how these changes in how people speak are related to their level of depression and their level of anxiety. And they have now the largest annotated database in the world. It's been looked at, it's been deployed in over 250 cities worldwide. And we have a database of 30,000 or so samples correlated to the PHQ-9 and GAD-7 scores. And within 20 seconds of any conversation, it can screen for depression and anxiety with the same accuracy as the PHQ-9 and the GAD-7 surveys, which is truly, it's actually an astounding feat because up until now, the evaluation of psychiatric conditions of all of medicine has been the most art and the least science. There have been no quantitative tools to determine when someone is depressed in the same way that there are, for example, cardiac markers to assess if someone's had a myocardial infarct, blood studies to check people's glucose level or their hemoglobin A1C, or radiographic studies to look for various anatomic abnormalities. Psychiatry is purely up to the clinician to have a conversation, evaluate the patient's mental wellness, and come up with a diagnosis. And this now creates a scalable, quantifiable, reproducible tool that can be used to assess someone's depression and anxiety level. Because of the fact that psychiatric conditions of any condition have been the most art and the least science, they are also one of the most underdiagnosed conditions in healthcare. It's estimated that only 50% of people who suffer from depression are ever diagnosed. And if we look at how common it is, well over 50% of people with any chronic disease have some degree of depression. And actually, a majority of people over the age of 65 have at least one chronic disease, and they're the most rapidly growing demographic in the United States is the elderly. The rate of depression amongst that group is very significant. In fact, as an emergency physician, almost all the time or very frequently when elderly come to the emergency department, they have depression as a comorbidity. And so now we have a tool that purely in the background can start to screen for that. Similarly with anxiety, anxiety disorder is now epidemic amongst the youth in the United States. It's estimated 1 out of 3 youth have some degree of anxiety disorder, which is incredibly unfortunate. And it speaks to a number of the socioeconomic issues that are facing the United States. But actually, it's becoming a global problem. The World Health Organization estimates that 1 in 7 youth worldwide has anxiety disorder. And so to be able to have a tool that in any conversation can now detect for these conditions is actually a significant benefit to first to the patients and just to our entire healthcare system. Also, it's well known that it's been well studied that, for example, people who have a chronic condition, who have untreated depression, their healthcare costs are 2 to 3 times larger than if their depression is treated. 65% of recurrent ED users have some degree of mental health condition. And so, and actually it's been recognized now that the depression is an independent variable in terms of people, in terms of individuals who develop coronary heart disease and atherosclerotic disease even. And actually there are other studies that suggest that all stress creates immunologic pathology that increases the risk of infection to a lot of other conditions. And so our ability to diagnose and screen for these conditions will actually significantly benefit the health of the United States.
I want to ask you, you mentioned about your voice biomarker is aligned with the survey that you mentioned. Can you tell us, like, what is that survey that the primary care use and the PHQ-9?
Yes. So the PHQ-9 is a survey, it's a questionnaire of 9 questions that are used in the primary care setting to do an initial assessment on whether someone suffers from some degree of depression. Similarly, the GAD-7 survey is another questionnaire where there are a number of questions asked to assess if someone suffers from anxiety disorder. There are 2 of them early screening surveys. They're not by any means the final diagnosis. And so the tool is not meant to provide a final diagnosis. It's meant to be a screening tool to flag individuals who may benefit from further evaluation. Then the clinician still needs to do a further assessment and determine if the patient suffers from significant depression or anxiety disorder. The tool is not a diagnostic tool. It's primarily meant as a screening tool. However, it is starting to be used in certain environments to follow longitudinally how patients are doing, because it can be used to sort of assess on a regular basis in a very non-invasive way how patients are coping with their depression or anxiety.
So does Kintsugi replacing the PHQ-9 method, or is that doing more?
Well, I wouldn't say it's replacing it. The PHQ-9 is rarely used. Only less than 4% of primary care patients are screened for depression. But it's estimated that 40% of primary care visits will eventually be virtual, or we're probably starting to approach that even now. And so what that really means, though, is probably closer to 100% of care will have some virtual component, because it's not 40% where 100% of their patients will be virtual, but really it's everyone will have some virtual care. The tool can be deployed when there is any audio file that's created. So it doesn't need to be a primary care virtual visit. It could be a follow-up call after someone's discharged from the hospital. Again, people with chronic conditions have some significant degree of depression. And so it could identify those patients. It can be used by call centers. It can be used in any environment where there is some type of audio file. We could have used it in this conversation, Christine.
I would love to use one. I'd like to know.
Well, the tool is available as a consumer app. You can go to Kintsugi Hello, and it's kintsugihello.com, and just download the app, and you can just use it as a voice journaling app, and it can and within it is embedded the voice assessment tool.
So how does it work? Like, so once you got that tool, and then it said like, well, you probably have a little, some sort of anxiety and depression, and then Kintsugi would refer that patient to a psychiatrist, or is it something that you have another app to help them?
So we don't provide the clinical services. What we do is we offer the tool to various clinical groups, and then they would need to create the workflows, the clinical workflows. So we would offer it to a clinical group, whether it's Kaiser or a family physician group or a health plan, and then they would use the tool, and then it would flag those patients for them so that they can decide how they wanted to address the patient. And the tool can be modified. So, for example, if they're interested in screening all patients, it can be used to provide the score across all the patients that they're seeing. Or if they were just interested in not missing their severely depressed patients, because they only have the labor, they may only have the psychiatric labor force within that clinical group to see the patients who are on the far left end of the spectrum who are severely depressed. Then what we can do is we can just flag the patients who would have a PHQ score greater than, say, 20 even, and only assess and only flag the severely depressed. So the tool can be used in a variety of different clinical scenarios, and it can be modified based on the clinical workflows.
Mm-hmm. So I'm just, my lack of understanding. I mean, when the patient is severely depressed, don't usually they know, and why would they need this tool? They probably can tell the doctor that I'm severely depressed, or is that not the case?
So it's interesting. There is a lot of stigma around mental health conditions. Still, it's unfortunate. There shouldn't be, but there is. And so often patients will not disclose for a variety of reasons to their clinician that they're depressed, that they're suicidal, that they feel like harming someone else. They'll just keep that to themselves, and they won't share that. Also, there can also be lack of even self-awareness sometimes. People may actually think that their depression is a physical problem, and they often have physical manifestations, and so they will come in with pain and aches, and they won't recognize it as a part of their depression. In fact, 45% of people who commit suicide have seen their primary care physician within the last 30 days before they committed suicide. I'm pretty sure that's the correct figure. So, and yet it's not clear whether they were seeking help for their mental health condition. They were just seeking medical treatment because they were obviously not doing well, or whether their clinician could have somehow been able to determine that they were having a mental health condition, because a lot of times it's very difficult for the clinician to assess for that, especially if either the patient isn't aware or the patient isn't letting on that they have that. If I could show you a video, is it possible for me to share? I would love to show, I know this is a podcast, but I would love to show you a video of the tool in action.
Uh, if you don't mind, you can send the link to us, and then we can include it in our podcast.
Okay.
Then people can click on it. If that would be really helpful, actually.
Okay. Let me see if I can arrange for that. And
Mhm.
because then you can see the tool in action where someone is just talking, and then the tool immediately assesses their level of depression and anxiety. You know what will happen, Christine, is I believe that tools like this will eventually create a paradigm shift
Mhm.
in mental health. Right now, when we look at mental health conditions, it's a very physician centric diagnosis, and we only look at the far left of the spectrum, people who have significant disease, so significant that they need to be seen by a physician or a psychiatrist or some other mental health professional, or they need some type of medication. But actually, all of us, everyone,
Mhm.
has some degree of depression and
Right.
anxiety. And when we create a tool that can be that's totally non-invasive, that is quantifiable for the whole population, we move mental health from a disease issue to a wellness issue. And it becomes
Mhm.
not a physician centric disease issue, but a population centric wellness issue. Because maybe people don't need a psychiatrist. Maybe all they need is some peer to peer counseling. Maybe all they need is a meditation app. Some people or they just need to interact with a chat bot even. So what it does is it totally it creates a paradigm shift in
Yeah.
how we view mental health in the U.S. So it not only helps us as a screening tool and identifying people who are unnecessarily suffering, it actually will eventually create a paradigm shift in how we look at mental health and mental wellness.
Yeah, and I was just thinking about how when I see my primary care, probably they spend less than 5 minutes with me, and I assume that would be hard for a primary care to diagnose somebody with mental health in that 5 minutes interaction.
Yes, they and so um, I'm of an age where I have to get annual physicals and various tests done on a regular basis, and there are all types. There's things to look at: colon health, heart health, lung health, diabetes, blood pressure, and if you in that 5 minute time, there's typically nothing that is there's no screening for our mental wellness or mental health.
So I'm just curious, what are the things that you picked up from the voice, the sound, like how you say it? Like, is this something that we as regular human being can pick up?
No. So it's not, because it's not. First of all, we're sampling on the millisecond level. The pieces of speech that we're picking out are not. They're very 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 short fragments, and then it requires a complex algorithm to understand how those various elements of speech, um, when we look at that, when we get that whole sample, all those various elements fit together to determine that individual's mental wellness or mental health status. So it's not. We can make some very general assumptions when we hear people speak on whether they may be depressed or anxious, but we certainly don't have the discrimination that the Kintsugi tool does to identify in a very quantitative way their exact degree of depression and
Mhm.
or anxiety. That's not possible to do.
Yeah. I know I'm short on time. I want to get your last question. What do you foresee how the kintsugi is going to change the whole industry?
So I think we will be a part of next generation mental health. We'll be part of the solution. I think that we're seeing changes in technology, and I don't, there's certainly other efforts. And I think that, for example, there are people who are looking at um, longitudinal monitoring, and they're doing things like looking at sleep patterns, how long we comb our hair for, how long we eat, and I believe that there will be information that will be derived from that, and that people, when they change their daily habits, they will be able to eventually correlate that with their mental wellness. There may be other types of studies, whether they're physiologic, neurohormonal studies, or others that will also advance our understanding of mental health. There was a recent article that suggested that medication therapy was just as effective as medication therapy plus psychoanalysis in treating depression. And so what that means is there's obviously some significant physiologic component to our mental health. And so eventually we'll come up with other diagnostic tools. So I think we'll be part of a becoming much more robust, quantitative, scientific methodology in evaluating mental health. By the way, I find it really interesting because the tool, like I said, does not look at content. It's not what the person says. It's actually the psychomotor response that has changed based on their psychiatric condition.
Mm-hmm.
And it is language and content agnostic, which is really interesting because what that means is that it doesn't matter what people's education level is. It doesn't matter the language they speak. It doesn't matter their ethnicity or what part of the world they're from. Everyone has a similar physiologic response in terms of how the physiologic response to their psychiatric condition. And I think that is an enormous step forward in just recognizing that in terms of how mental health is treated in this world.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, it was a real pleasure, Christine. By the way, I really, really do appreciate the mission. If there's anything I can do to help with the Rosamond Institute, please let me know.
Oh, well, definitely. I really appreciate your offering. We definitely rely a lot on people like you to support many of our programs.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Health Technology Podcast. We want to thank our executive producer, Herminio Neto, and our podcast engineer, Andrew Rojek. If you enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe and leave a review. The Health Technology Podcast is available on all major platforms.